Hi everyone. Again, Brittany, Dr. Aronson, whatever you want to call me is fine. I'm going to be recording from my laptop to my desktop the lecture for this week. I'm sorry about the poor quality, but I actually spent a lot of time recording this lecture, and it's 45 minutes long, and I don't want to have to re-record it all. But for whatever reason on my desktop, there's something corrupt with it, and it won't save. So the only way that I'm going to be able to upload the work that I've already done here is if I re-record it. So I'm going to be recording it, and like I said, hopefully it'll just be this week. I apologize for it not being the best of quality, but I'm glad I'm able to at least do this. So stay tuned for this week's class lecture. Hi everyone, welcome to the first week of introduction or of EDL 621. In this session we're going to talk about multicultural education, and I decided to do a lecture to kind of work through these beginning articles and to think about some of these conceptual frameworks and how we will be using them throughout this semester and in the readings in this class. But before we begin, there's something I want you to think about. And I want you to, if you haven't already done the readings or you're working through them, I really wanted you to think about like how you thought about multicultural education coming into this class, what it meant to you, and as you're going through the readings and as well as after you've done the readings and watched the documentary, think about what does multicultural education mean to you. This is a concept that historically, when you ask the general public about this, a lot of times it's associated with this idea of diversity training or cultural sensitivity, and really multicultural education is so much more than that, particularly in terms of the ways that we're going to look at it in this class. Before we can begin though, I know that there are some terms that we really need to break down and we really need to talk about. This might be review for some of you, but for others of you who are new to any of this type of, let's first start with this idea of cultural capital. May and Sleater mentioned this in their introduction text here. They mentioned the idea of cultural capital. And really what this is thinking about is these linguistic and cultural competencies that individuals inherit. Giroux writes a lot about this. If you've been in EDL before, you know who Henry Giroux is. If you're new to the program, then this might be a person who's new to you, but you will surely hear more about him. When we think about cultural capital, though, this idea of capital, right, it's something that you acquire, something that you have. And linguistic capital, a lot of times that's in turn, if you think about like linguistics and language, predominantly English is the primary language of power, and the higher vocabulary you have, the more standard English that you use, that typically equates you with more education, more wealth, more knowledge. So that idea of that type of capital comes about in things such as the vocabulary and whatnot. And there's other cultural ideas of capital. And a simple example to think about in terms of cultural capital, part of this is like wanting to do a cultural activity, or this is cultured, someone who goes to the museum or the ballet and this and that. And these are all concepts of what equates someone who is educated and cultured in society. When we think about this cultural capital, though, this certain capital that you possess is what distinguishes whether or not you are able to really rise above in your social mobility. It's important to ask, though, that when we're talking about this is whose culture are we talking about? So in terms of looking at what's normalized, a lot of times you'll hear us talking about like this westernized or very Eurocentric culture. And it's important to ask about what culture, and that's what we're going to problematize throughout this course when we think about what's considered to be the norm and who really gets to decide what that norm is. Okay. Another concept that we're going to talk about, critical social justice. So just using the word social justice is important to really think about. This idea is this is specifically along different types of social group lines such as race, class, gender, sexuality, and ability, and other forms of identities. So what's important about a critical social justice is that we've recognized this inequality exists. It's deeply embedded, so it's structural. We'll talk a little bit more about both these ideas. But the part that makes it critical is that you actively seek to change this. So when we talk about critical social justice, we're talking about seeking change. So some other terms that were used throughout these readings. We've seen how things are talked about being Eurocentric. I often use the term white stream. I'll use that because it directly is relating to race over ethnicity, because people hear Euro and not everyone is necessarily white either. Excuse me. But what this refers to is thinking about, like, particularly in terms of curriculum. The curriculum taught in schools is primarily from the perspectives of Americans. So a classic narrative that we hear in schools is this idea of Christopher Columbus, how he sailed the ocean blue, he discovered America, and he colonized it, and it's this wonderful land that it is today. What we fail to often recognize is the idea that there was already many nations of people living here, and it was already colonized. So those perspectives don't always get told as accurately in schools. So that's the idea of talking about when things are white-streamed or Eurocentric. It's coming from that one perspective. Okay. Another term that's going to keep coming up throughout this course is hegemony. We might see this written in the word hegemony. It might be hegemonic forces, hegemonic ideology, and it's a really, really abstract term. So it's this idea of domination where, and I have in quotes here, this ruling group exercises control over allied groups. Now, this doesn't necessarily, I'm not picturing this dictator who's coming in and ruling in a country, which very well that could be, that could come, hegemonic forces could be behind that, but it's really even deeper than that, because it's this control of consciousness, your own consciousness that you may not even really think about. And that's something to really dissect and continuously reflect upon. So we oftentimes don't even recognize the control that this has over us. So keep that in mind. And I'll be talking about examples of hegemony throughout the course and the semester. Okay. So another important thing that came up in Marian Sleater's piece was liberalism. And this is the philosophical thought or worldview. And especially in American culture, there's this emphasis on individualism. You work really hard as the individual, and you are able to progress and have social mobility in society. So when we talk about liberal multiculturalism, what's really important about that is that if we all come in this idea of from liberty, there's an emphasis on treating everyone the same, regardless of gender, race, and ethnicity. So this is where that colorblind approach has come in. We saw this a lot in the origins of multicultural education. Let's just treat everyone the same. Everyone's equal. We don't see differences. I'm sure you've all heard people say things like, I don't see color. Well, of course we do. We all see color. And we have to problematize why we would suggest that we don't see color and don't see difference. And that's really where the critical aspect of multiculturalism comes in and challenges this notion. So this goes hand in hand with this idea also of meritocracy. Especially in American society, we've often heard, scholars have really critiqued this, and we've talked about this idea of a myth of meritocracy. That society, meritocracy recognizes, okay, society is stratified, yes, we know, but the reason that this stratification has happened is because particular people or groups, they just don't work very hard. So rather than there being bias or anything being unfair, it's that people just don't work very hard, so therefore that's why they don't succeed. So we also have to problematize this idea, because we're in this situation, you're failing to recognize historical implications of discrimination and practices that are instilled in society today. And I think that Senso and D'Angelo's text is really going to help to see some of these deeper structural issues that are embedded in what has become normalized to us. Again, here's hegemony, and how we have to continue to problematize that. Okay, and finally, one other concept that I want to break down for today is this idea of neoliberalism. That is it's a very popular term in education right now. And this definitely comes out of a political ideology that suggests that humans can with capitalism. Strong private property rights, free market, free trade, all of that's going to create this competition, that's going to create this more fruitful society if we all work really hard together and we create this competition with one another. We see neoliberalism in education right now through things such as charter schools. Charter schools are schools that are they are public schools, but they're financed. They receive public funding, but then they also receive additional funding through philanthropists and other types of nonprofit groups. Although there are some for-profit charters as well, and it takes away from public education because it's producing this competitive model. We also see this in teacher education. We see this through programs such as Teach for America, which recruits, quote, the best and the brightest from the prestigious universities in the country. These are people who have degrees in content areas. They have very little pedagogical training. And the idea behind that is, well, we really just need to know this content well. And they put them in schools, such as in urban or rural schools, that don't necessarily provide as much support. Now, there are many different ways that Teach for America works, and not to say that people who are in Teach for America aren't dedicated teachers. But if we're thinking again back to the bigger picture of neoliberalism, the idea behind this is let's create this competition with teacher education, and let's have these different types of ways of going about this so that we can better public or we can better education, or through privatizing educate more with teacher education. So essentially neoliberalism goes hand in hand with capitalism, and it's all about the market and being able to really think about how we can create this competition in the market. Okay. So with that being said, there are two last things that I thought we should talk about that's going to come up throughout this semester, and that is looking at these words of equity versus equality. So we're going to throw them out here a lot, and it's really important to think about. So when we talk about equality, we are talking about all things being the same. So if we give an equal education, here we go here. Like, so we have all of these, this is, you know, the playing field. They're all equal for each of these students, but not everyone comes from the same background or has the same, not everyone's the same here, as we know. So just because we provide equality doesn't necessarily mean that we're providing access to something here. Equity, though, if we're talking about fairness, different people are coming from different situations. So, and historically, there's been implications of, especially in education for students of color, for example, about the access to education. We're not all coming from the same playing field. So if you look about, we're talking about equity, we might have to provide different resources and to go about teaching in different ways so that we are providing access to education. So these, I think, pictures here really help to paint the picture of the differences between when we're talking about equality versus equity. And I have a short little video here that I'm going to show you about, so the opportunity gap is what a lot of scholars refer to the achievement gap. And I hope for those of you, I'm sure most everyone has heard of the achievement gap, and that essentially refers to how your students from predominantly middle class and white backgrounds, white and Asian students from middle class backgrounds, continuously succeed and perform higher on achievement tests than students from African American / Black, Latino, and American Indian, Native American, Pacific Islander, other types of backgrounds. So essentially students of color, and from lower socioeconomic status. That's important to note as well. But some scholars have actually changed this name to call it the opportunity gap, because it's not necessarily about the achievement of the students themselves. It's about how society has structured education that continues to perpetuate the status quo. So this is a short little video that highlights this nicely. And here we go. I thought I actually had it up. Sorry.
Hey, be careful with that.
It's okay, it's not working.
And my nose came off.
Should be able to skip that. So this example here is really talking about an example of equity here that's talking like that's how affirmative action might be considered using equity, because it's talking about fairness and trying to level the playing field. There's some other things that actually are, if you think about the in chapter 2 of the Senso and D'Angelo book on page 19 here, they talk about a study on discrimination. And it's really interesting. The resumes of 1,300 people, or 5,000 resumes, or something like that, 50% more callbacks were given to people with white-sounding names versus people with black-sounding names. So right there, when we talk about hegemony, actually, that might be an example of hegemony, because it's not necessarily that people are openly trying to discriminate or be racist against people, but they're not even recognizing perhaps the internal bias that they have toward names and what the power of names and what this means for people. So this is why this is something that's important to think about when we're thinking about critical social justice and multicultural education. Okay. So there are several conceptual frameworks that really make up what we're talking about today when we talk about multicultural education. And really, this is critical multicultural education, because we've evolved past this idea of just multicultural education. And some of the other influencing factors in this this discipline are critical theory, sometimes which informs critical pedagogy. That's a part of it. Anti-racist education, which comes out of a lot of British studies, and then critical race theory, which comes out of legal studies, and then critical social justice education. That's what I primarily subscribe to. But all of these different frameworks influence each other and are really important parts of understanding multicultural education. So I'm just going to give a little background of some of this information. So multicultural education, it's often associated, especially in America, with race and ethnicity, and this is coming out of the civil rights movement in the 1960s. That doesn't mean that this work hasn't actually been done historically, and I'll talk about that a little bit with it's coming from. Diversity became a really important buzzword in the 1990s, and that's where multicultural education really started to become prevalent in education. A lot of this, in 1991, Jonathan Kozol wrote a very famous book called Savage Inequalities, which really highlighted the disparities seen in schools, especially between more white suburban school settings and more urban students of color, those living in poverty and rural settings. It really highlighted these discrepancies between school, and it really brought an awareness. So we started to see a lot of this stemming in the 90s. Critical pedagogy does work hand in hand with, and I'll go a little more specifically into it, with multicultural education. It grew out of a class struggle. A lot of times we see Paulo Freire, he was in Brazil. He did a lot of his work stemming out of class relations in the 1970s. But then there's other scholars, especially in Europe. That's where a lot of the European work that relates to this, it comes from class struggles, not as much race struggles, which is what we see a lot more in the United States, which we have seen historically. So in the 60s and 70s, it gave rise to critical pedagogy in the U.S., which in turn really produced this family values movements in the 1980s. And Sleeter talks a little bit about this as she talks about how A Nation at Risk came out, and A Nation at Risk was a report that really talked about how we were falling behind, America was falling behind compared to China and Japan, and if we didn't find ways to get back to the basics, which was a big, under the Reagan administration, there was a big push to get back to the basics, reading, writing, and arithmetic, with this standardized curriculum, and that's where we really start to see standardized curriculum and standardized testing beginning to emerge. So at the same time that that's happening, there's this push of the diversity of schools, and how we really have to prepare for how the changing demographics in this country are going to impact teachers and students in schools. So you can look at this quote here, multicultural education and critical pedagogy, they both come from specific struggles. So as I said, multicultural education is really coming from race and ethnicity out of the civil rights movement, and critical pedagogy is really coming from class in both South America and in Europe. But they're both talking about resisting oppression in these different ways. So we can learn from both of these struggles and how they've really begun to shape this field of multicultural education. So let's talk a little bit more about that. With this knowledge, May and Sleeter, they ask us to keep in mind, like, thinking about these structural inequalities, they continue to persist. So in 2015, these structural inequalities continue to persist. So multiculturalism, they're saying, well, that hasn't obviously fixed anything, so why are we continuing to talk about this? What's important to that's why it's so important that we understand the history of multiculturalism and the different political and economic struggles that have impacted it, because it hasn't always continued to receive the support that it needs, especially nowadays as we become more liberalism, as liberalism has really shaped and impacted schools. The decrease of an impact on multiculturalism is present. So even though we've been talking about multicultural education since the 90s and even before that, if you want to trace back to some other, it wasn't necessarily called multicultural education, but if we can trace back historically other origins of similar concepts here. We continue to have these structural inequalities, and so we continue to need to have these conversations, and we continue to need to be informed of the inequity that we see in schools. So a reason why we've seen multicultural education fading in schools, a lot of the time it was looked at as like this solution to fix, and obviously it's important to say, quote, fix the problem of ethnic and racial diversity. So how do we deal with those kids? And a lot of early scholars talked about how, well, this conflict, it's a misunderstanding of differences. We just don't understand each other. Sonia Nieto might have coined this, and it's this holidays and heroes approach. You'll hear me say that from time to time. So holidays and heroes approach, okay? We're being multicultural. This is multicultural education. If in February we celebrate Black History Month and we save all of our conversations about African Americans and the contributions they've made to American culture, we're going to do that in February. But then think about it. Well, what's done the other 11 months of the year? So when we think about that, this holidays and heroes just essentializing a group of people to 1 month. And the same thing, we've seen this now with Hispanic Heritage Month is in November. We have Women's History Month in March. We have Asian American History Month in April. And we have to problematize this because if, again, we're essentializing groups of people and we're boxing them into like this 1 month instead of it making this a collective culture of our history, of American culture and history. So multicultural educators problematize these early notions of just because we have these special holidays and days, that's not multicultural education. We are not learning about groups of people, separating them in that way, and that's really just essentializing them and not necessarily making this a part of our everyday curriculum. So that early on approach, you've heard me already say this word colorblind, it's not critical enough. If we act, okay, everyone, we're all the same, but we're still going to celebrate these special holidays, but we're all the same. Especially in terms of like this push against multicultural education, middle-class white, particularly white man, and or monolingual English speakers, this critique has become like, well, they are the new minority, so this is reverse discrimination. Yet again, I ask you to think about, if we have 1 month of the year, February is where you African American History Month, what are we doing the other 11 months of the year? It's be called the new minority. So we have to problematize these ideas of what does this mean when we're talking about multicultural education. In turn, this has set the stage for other ways to think about social justice. So let's look at some of the other frameworks. But first, let me think about going back to May and Sleeter. They also ask us to think about, when we are talking about multicultural education, we really have to think about this idea of intersectionality. And you will hear me bring this up also throughout this semester. So everything we're talking about, even though I've had to break up topics each week, which I need to problematize because of the fact that intersectionality exists. However, in terms of teaching and how we can go about this, that's the way that we have to do it. But at the same time, I want to problematize that, because we all have multiple identities and they intersect and they impact us in different ways. So coming right from that May and Sleeter piece, we understand we have multiple collectives and we share these multiple identities, and they're not separate from one another, they intersect. So as we're examining culture in many different ways, we need to think about these different layers and how they impact one another. So just for example, when we talk about feminism, the way feminism looked for a white middle-class female might have looked very different for a black lower-class female. So these struggles of being female but your race make a very big impact in how you might pursue something or be perceived. Okay, So as I mentioned before, critical theory stems out of class struggles. It has to do with a lot of the day-to-day lives of people. And a lot of the critique that began, especially when critical theory became popular in the United States, it came out of this idea of thinking about oppression and the reproduction of inequality. So when we talk about capitalism and meritocracy, as I mentioned before, we have to think about how there's problematized in not only economics and those discussions, but in schools and thinking about schools in lower socioeconomic class neighborhoods and funding and how that works. And so these might be the types of critical theory, types of approaches and critiques that you see in schooling. A critique of critical theory is that it is conceptually dense. If any of you have tried to read Giroux or Peter McLaren, it can be challenging. And another critique, though, is there's also a lack of attention given to race, ethnicity, and gender. So with that being said, critical race theory became a part of educational discourse in 1995, to be precise. Latson Billings and William Tate, who are two, early on they could have been considered multicultural education scholars. They had done a lot of reading of Derek Bell. So this book right here, if you are interested in critical race theory, everyone should have this book and read about it. Faces from the Bottom of the Well, it's a classic. But critical race theory comes out of legal studies, and it derived in the 1970s, and it was talking about how essentially working through racism in this country, which in America and in other colonized nations, such as Australia and South Africa, have similar struggles. We have had race relations and struggles that have lasted. Their problems lie with class. So, like I said, initially this developed out of the work of Derek Bell, Alan Freeman, Richard Delgado. These are all legal scholars, and CRT directly is focused on race and racism, and it simultaneously addresses the hegemonic system of white supremacy on the meritocracy system. So all of those words are in there. You talk about hegemony, white supremacy, and I can't say it now, meritocratic system. So that's the meritocracy aspects. Important to note, though, here, I'd like to make sure I emphasize this, is that critical race theory is an analytical framework, and it was brought into education, like I said, in 1995. However, there are several scholars who talk about how CRT goes back as far as W.E.B. Du Bois, Sojourner Truth, Frederick Douglass, Cesar Chavez, and other Black Power and Chicano movements of the 60s and 70s. So this work, again, maybe it wasn't named that, but people have been doing this work of addressing racism in the United States of America. So it's been something that has been going on for a long time. So I'd like to make sure that credit is given. And now CRT has expanded, and it's included other branches such as Latino critical race theory, so that's called Lat Crit, critical race feminist theory, feminist crit, and then looking at American Indian, Native American populations, and that's called tribal crit. So there's a lot of different ways that people have looked at how racism has manifested itself throughout, specifically United States and in American society and culture. So there are 5 main tenets that are often, I'm using these 5 tenets. There are some people, Delgado has more recently written about social justice, which is, of course, I think an important tenet in critical race theory. But DeClore and Dixon's article outlined these 5 tenets, and so that's what I'm going to talk about. So the first tenet is counter storytelling. And if you're using critical race theory as an analytical framework, you're thinking about how you might counter what would be the dominant narrative. So again, an example like I showed before about Christopher Columbus, if you're giving a counter narrative to that, you might think about how American Indian populations would discuss such an encounter of Columbus coming to America. And in fact, what I keep thinking of in my head is a book written by a children's literature book by Jane Yolen called Encounter. It's a really interesting book written from the perspective of the American Indian group. I think it's the Towels. And it's about Columbus's landing. So I think that could be a simple example of a counter narrative. But a lot of times is allowing for other voices to come to the discussion and to push back against the dominant narrative that we hear in schools. So that's one very important part of critical race theory. Another important part to recognize is the permanence of racism. And so Derek Bell writes about this, is that, racism is permanent. It's everlasting in society. And he says that we must live with this dread, which is, I know, really, really depressing. But at the same time, this dread, which might feed to anger and defiance, it's not wasteful. okay, we recognize this problem, but it provides anger, but then let's use this anger for something. And we'll read about that in Audre Lorde's piece next week. We can easily see the permanence of racism in terms of othering. I mean, I do it every day. I catch myself doing it every day because it's so instilled within me, how we so easily other by saying those and them. Those schools, that classroom. Just pay attention to your language throughout the next week and think about how you position people and places, and see if you catch yourself othering, because it's definitely a part of our everyday norms. And this typically happens when a person coming from a position of power or privilege describes another group, but not necessarily just a person from power and privilege, because if you're not part of a group in power, it doesn't necessarily mean that you don't still subscribe to some of these ideas because of hegemony and how things are socially instilled within us. So critical race scholars want us to continuously critique this idea. And Thompson, she asks us to be thoughtful and engaged. Like an example she gives is when using citations, thinking about people's work. I know that that's something that I do when I plan classes and when I do my own writing. I think about who I'm citing and who I'm talking about, and I especially if I'm talking about people of color, I'm coming from a position of being a white female. So I think it's important that I be respectful and that I problematize this relationship that I have with writing about people. And again, like I said, I'm othering even as I'm talking about that. So it's a situation I can't necessarily work my way around, but I have to continuously reflect and think about it. So that's kind of what scholars are talking about when they ask us to have whiteness as property. We'll talk a little more about this when we watch the Tim Wise documentary. You may or may not have heard the concept white privilege before. Peggy McIntosh wrote an article in the late 70s, 80s, I think, and she became really famous for knowing about this. But this is just the idea of it's a right of possession, what you typically have when you're white, asking questions of who gets into what spaces, the right to disposition, the right to enjoy these privileges. Who has this right? Who gets to enjoy this privilege? So we're going to unpack this term a little bit more of white privilege and talk about it. So something that's important I want to make sure that I note here is when I talk about whiteness, or I talk about white supremacy, or when I talk about white privilege, this is a system. This is a bigger system. It is an ideology. It's something that is instilled in culture. I'm not talking about an individual of a white person, and an individual white person. So as we talk about this, and remember, everyone, we're having this willingness to be disturbed. If you're feeling disturbed as we're talking about this, just try to think back too. So think about those feelings that you're having. Think about why you're disturbed. And then, but also remember that I'm talking about a bigger system, a bigger picture. And we'll see some examples of this, especially this is one of my favorite examples to think about. Initially, Eastern Europeans, particularly if you think about the Irish Catholic immigrants, when they first came over here, they were on the same social level as African Americans in this country in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And it wasn't until the Irish Americans began really assimilating and taking advantage of their skin color and assimilating to higher status. So there's a really interesting book about this called How the Irish Became White, if anyone's more interested in learning about that. But so that, I think, is a really prevalent example of the power of race in society and how that really continues to impact us. Okay, the fourth tenet of CRT is interest convergence. And this talks about how serving self-interest of those in power, essentially. So when we think about actually when schools were integrated, if you read any of James Anderson's work, The History of Blacks in the South, African American students were doing in the schools that they were not funded well, but there was great teachers and leaders in schools, and educating students was very powerful. So when schools were forced to integrate, let's think about this. It wasn't the white students who were going to the black schools. It was the black students going to the white schools. And obviously, I mean, we know from history a lot of the discrimination and just suffering that occurred. So that doesn't necessarily seem like that's benefiting. Wasn't about granting this education or equalizing things for black and white students. The U.S. was receiving a lot of scrutiny in the public eye, especially in Europe and other countries that haven't had as recent of racial struggles as the U.S. have had. So the U.S. looked really bad in worldwide. The way, and we've seen this a little bit with how the North would see things on television of the South. Well, to the world, we looked a fool. So essentially, he argues that this is a case of interest convergence. It wasn't about doing good for black students. It was really about making the U.S. look better. So in a CRT critique of such, it's about benefiting that person who's in power and privilege. Okay. And then lastly, The last tenet of CRT that we'll talk about is a critique of liberalism. And when I talk about liberalism, again, I'm not talking about liberal conservative in terms of like thinking about, you know, liberal Democrats, conservative Republicans. That's not what I mean. It's an idea of liberalism, as we were talking before in the definition, is that the neutrality of law, if we're all treated the same, then everything will be okay. So like, for instance, in schools, we have these zero tolerance policies. There's zero tolerance for anything, and therefore that's a way of equalizing everything. However, if you've done any research into zero tolerance policies or any discipline gaps, school to prison line, any research like that consistently shows how students of color, particularly black males, are suspended, expelled from schools at higher rates, and therefore fed into the school to prison line, is talking about the high rates of incarceration. So all of this stuff is what CRT scholars critique in terms of what's happening on in schools. Okay. So also similarly to critical race theory is anti-racist education, but this really stemmed out of Britain and Canada and other areas of class struggles. And the critique really came from that multicultural education was not, it didn't really talk about race very much, and it's codified. It was more about, multicultural education was more about white middle class professionals understanding how they could work with these kids and perceive the needs of and interests of, quote, the students of color. They saw it as a way to manage the problems. So they problematized that in multicultural education. So scholars around anti-racist education really was worried about the watered down versions of race. So, I mean, they're similar when we talk about anti-racist education versus critical race theory. Critical race theory is coming out of this legal context, and anti-racist education is coming out of this class context, but really is directly related as well to anti-racist education. This has also been critiqued for its focus only on race, so not necessarily looking at gender and class. So each of these frameworks can be critiqued. And then critical multiculturalism is what Sleeter and May and Sleeter, are talking about in the piece that we read, the introduction here. And this is taking multiculturalism and as it's developed, incorporating these other frameworks and thinking about the word critical, which again, Sensoy and D'Angelo really talk about what this means to be critical in those opening chapters. But we're thinking about the structure. We're adding the structural analysis here. We're adding a lot of different components here. What's institutionalized, what's structuralized, how is power operated, what is culture, there's other interdisciplinary fields, like sociology helps us out here, anthropology, political studies. And then international education has begun to become a really important part of critical multiculturalism when we think about what this means on the global level. So that's a new push that we're seeing in critical multiculturalism. And then lastly, this is new that I've added this to this course, but this is a framework that I use, that I talk about, and I talk about it because I would argue in multicultural education, or whatever term you want to use when we're talking about studying inequity in schools, there's so many different frameworks, so many different positions we can come from. And I believe that the context that you're talking about, as well as your own positionality, is what is going to be important for why and how you use something. So, to give an example for myself, critical race theory, that comes out of, like I said, I think it's really important. I think it's an incredibly, it's influenced me very much in my own work. But I'm a white female working in the context of, in my own positionality, so I'm not going to necessarily use critical race theory in my work. However, it's going to inform me. I'm going to come back to it. I'm going to talk about it. So that might be an example of how you learn about different positions, like tribal crit. I'm not American Indian. That's not where I come from. But it can inform me. I can learn about oppression and differences, and just gain my own knowledge through that conceptual framework. So I choose to use the framework of critical social justice education, and this is really, and some important things that I can pull from Sensoy and D'Angelo's text is how knowledge is socially constructed. So really we are all coming from these different positions, and we're all coming to our own truths, but we can be informed by each other. Critical self-reflection is imperative, and that's of course the ultimate goal of this course, is that you are really critically reflecting on yourself and thinking about your own position in society as we go through these readings and we go through these interactions with each other. And I have a couple quotes here from the text here about how critical thinking is not just about different opinions, but really thinking about these different layers. And we sometimes really need to be able to think about how we're not objective. And I mean, I believe if we think we're objective, we're just fooling ourselves. So you may or may not agree with me there, but I think it's better to admit that and to come to terms with it and work around it than to try to act like we can be objective. So that's something that I often talk about when I talk about my own positionality. Okay, and just to sum up here, these are some of the big leaders, though, of the multicultural education movement. So up here we have Sonia Nieto, and she does a lot of work with language and literacy and a lot of American Indian work as well. We have James Banks. He, you've probably heard about his models of multicultural education. If not, you Christine Slater. This is Christine Slater. And she does a lot of, well, you've read her for today. She does a lot of work as well, multicultural education. She also does a lot of work on white pre-service teachers. So this is Lori Latson-Billing. She's not really a critical race scholar, but she's the person who brought critical race theory into education. She is most well known for culturally relevant pedagogy, which is a conceptual framework about effective practices. She specifically worked with African American students, but that framework has now been used across many different groups of students in many differences. And then Geneva Gay also, she is associated with culturally responsive teaching, and so they're both very, very similar. She's focusing more on pedagogy, she's focusing more on teaching. So these are some of the really big names that if you end up doing anything in multicultural education, you really want to know who these people are, because they are some of the founding scholars that have really set the stage and provided some important foundations that we can use as we. With that being said, as we go through these questions, or as we go through this week, so if you have, first of all, if you have any questions about anything that I have gone over or talked about, by all means ask me, and I'd be happy to provide an answer. Your first discussion post is going to be due by Thursday, June 18th at 6 p.m. And you're going to, oh, that should say respond to each of your group members by 6 p.m. the next day. So, and your Google Hangout is also on June 18th, your first one from 3 to 4. Now, you're already in groups, and I'll go back and show you it again. You're already situated in groups, and so the person who's the leader is going to initiate the call. And as I talk with you all throughout this week, I'll talk with each of you about using Google Hangout. So these are the group leaders for week 1. And so ordinarily, each week we'll have a group leader, and it's going to cover 2 sessions. Because we only have 1 session this week, these group leaders will only be for 6/18. So these groups are going to change each week, and I'm going to show you one more time where everything is. Your first reflection is due on Canvas by the end of the day on that Friday on 6/19. So remember that Thursday and Friday is pretty booked with the tasks that you have to do. So make sure you're pacing yourself and keeping yourself in mind. And then for next week, I'll be posting the following week's stuff. Each Friday I will be posting the following week's stuff. So for class 2 and 3, which is essentially the following week, so there's 2 classes, there'll be 2 different discussion boards, but only 1 Google Hangout in which you'll discuss the combined topics together. So for class 2, we're going right into race and ethnicity, and so there's the documentaries Race, Power, and Illusion and White Like Me, so please watch those. And then you have Senso and D'Angelo, chapter 7 and 8, The Lord and the Tatum Thesis. And then for class 3, we have the documentary Real Bad Arabs, and then we have the James, the White, and the Rubin thesis. So lots of reading for next week, lots of documentaries. It does lighten up a little bit as we go, but definitely there's a lot going on next week, so make sure you pace yourself. Real quick, I'll just show you again, just to make sure. When you're on the Canvas website, under discussions, I will be posting this. It should, by the time you get this video, this should be live, but once you hit on what is multicultural education, you have your discussion board right here. So here are your questions. Now each of you have groups. It should just show your group when I pull it up. I have access to all of them, so they're all up here. So here's group 1. And so the question, like I said, is right here. So, and I'm sorry if I've said anyone's name wrong. Hopefully as we meet this week, I'll make sure I get everyone's name right. But these are your group members. These are who you're working with. And when I talk about the Pages feature, remember it's over here to the left, Pages. So the group member, so for this group was Marcia. You'll add, or Marcy, sorry. You'll add a page and you'll type your notes here. So you might call it a Google Hangout meeting or whatever. And you're basically like taking some notes. So as you're talking, you're taking notes with one another. So, and that way you hit save and I'll be able to see that. So that'll be helpful. If there's anything you want to share with each other too, you have the option to share files, announcements, all kinds of brand stuff. These groups, though, will be changing each week, though, so keep that in mind. One more thing. On the Google Drive, I have added multicultural education terminology. And this is a document that I will be keeping up with different terms as we go through these readings. Although Cynthia and D'Angelo are really good about defining things. But there's a lot of terms here that if you need some help as reading with understanding things, this is kind of like a little dictionary. Also, you can add comments in it here as well. So if there's a term that you feel isn't quite each other, we'll continue to add as we go through. So I wish you all a very well week. I look forward to talking to you all. And yeah, I will be in touch. So please keep tuned to my email.